are delving into what could be one of the worst decisions for our democracy. Let's talk about the hush money.
There was absolutely no crime involved in paying her to keep that story quiet.
Do you agree with that?
No. Payment was made 2 weeks before the election. It was done with the intent to make sure it did not come out before.
Do you believe this case will be reversed? If this could happen to ex-President Donald Trump, it could happen to any one of us. I believe that this is a travesty of justice. I believe it was unfair to Donald Trump and an abuse of our legal system with damaging consequences. And this is not about Donald Trump. This is about abuse of process. This is about due process. And this opens a Pandora's box of extreme proportion. And joining me tonight to discuss this historic case are former prosecutor and News on Merritt Street anchor Lonnie Coombs, and my good friend who has left an indelible mark on the courtroom, a Dallas trial lawyer for 50 years, recognized as one of the best lawyers in this city 11 times, just an absolute brilliant legal mind with a commitment to justice, Mr. Rod Phelan. Welcome these experts, please. Now, Rod, I have said that I thought this was a travesty of justice, and I guess what I'm talking about is the fact that this was a case supposedly about hush money. This was a case about business records that were supposedly illegal. And first off, let's talk about the hush money that this whole thing was predicated on. There's a problem with that, and the problem is that there's nothing wrong. This is a made-up term to sound scandalous, but that's just another term for a non-disclosure agreement, is it not?
There are thousands, millions of non-disclosure agreements. Their very purpose is to hush up the person who is receiving the payment to be quiet. That's what a non-disclosure agreement is. And this prosecution in this case was allowed to say that paying her for silence was illegal. But she had no duty to tell that story. She had every right to keep it quiet or sell it. And paying her to keep that story quiet was, you can be critical of it. You can think that wasn't a nice thing to do, nor was her story a nice one to hear. But there was absolutely no crime involved in paying her to keep that story quiet. And that's the heart of the case, that this was an illegal payment.
But if there's no crime in paying someone to not tell a story that is not flattering, if there's no crime in that, Lonnie, then how is there a case to be brought against a defendant based on how you keep those records?
Right. So the prosecution theory in this case was that there were falsified documents, right? So we all know having an affair is not a crime. Paying hush money is not a crime. Having an NDA is not a crime. But when it is done by someone who is running for political office, that person is now subject to laws and rules under campaign finance rules, election laws, that the normal person isn't. So if we did an NDA, we wouldn't have anybody looking at us so closely. But if we are running for office, then all of a sudden we have these other rules applying to us.
Okay, but keeping the records, this was not a campaign expense. This was a personal expense, was it not?
So that is what the prosecution said. No, it was a campaign expense. And they talked about it being, if it was not done within the time that it was done, right before the election, that is what the prosecution believes showed was the intent to interfere with the election. So Stormy Daniels came forward in 2016 and tried to sell her story at the beginning of the year. Nobody wanted it. Nobody cared about it. When the Access Hollywood tape came out in October 7th, just before the election, then all of a sudden the negotiations started to try and work out this deal with Stormy Daniels. It was actually done. The money was wired on the 27th. So the prosecution said, this is evidence of intent to try and interfere with the election. It's not just a typical payment, hush money, NDA. It is because of the timing of the deal, because of everything else that was going on in the campaign. That's what they said showed that this was an attempt, an intent to interfere with the election.
What do you say to that, Rod?
Well, the prosecution did pitch the case as a, quote, election fraud case, pure and simple. But election fraud has to be something that was illegal that happened before the election. But Trump was only indicted for creating records about paying Cohen back after the election. Trump was not charged with doing anything before the election. So what you're charged with doing happened after the election, it can't be an election fraud case.
No, but your point is this happened in 2017 is when they made these entries, these bookkeeping entries, was after the election.
That's right, that's right. And that's the interesting thing. So the way the prosecutor had to file this was the initial argument, the initial charge is falsifying the documents, right? So all of the payments were falsified because they said they were legal expenses, it wasn't this reimbursement.
After the election.
And they were all paid after the election. However, the prosecution put on a case that said the agreement that was made between Trump and David Pecker, and David Pecker testified to this, and Michael Cohen, this arrangement to try and keep these bad stories out of the press, started way back in August of 2015.
And was not illegal.
No, that arrangement's not illegal. However, that's part of it, and then when the payment was made to Stormy Daniels at the time just before the election, that part goes into the financial documents. So the financial documents were actually not falsified until after the election. You're absolutely correct.
But the payment was not illegal.
No, well, that's what the prosecution is saying. It's not the hush money payment that's illegal. It's the intent to interfere with the election by making that to suppress the story.
Right. Now, I want to look quickly at a timeline of what took place here, because in 2006, Daniels says she had sex with Trump. He says not so. Then 2015, Trump decides to run for president. And then in October of 16, this is a month before the election, Daniels' lawyer makes a $130,000 hush money demand, and Trump's lawyer, Cohen, pays it. November 2016, he wins the election. February 2017, he starts paying Cohen back plus taxes. Now, November 2020, Alvin Bragg makes a campaign promise that if he's elected DA, he will go after Trump. He wins. And then in April 2023, DA Bragg indicts Trump, and then in April 2024, he tells the jury in an opening statement that this is a case of election fraud, pure and simple. And then in May 2024, the jury convicts Trump. Now let's back up to the one right before being convicted, and that's where he says that he tells the jury in opening statements, this is a case of election fraud, pure and simple. And he makes a campaign promise that he's going to get him. Now, here's the thing. He says he made illegal payments. Were those payments illegal?
They were not by any stretch. And the fact that a campaigning politician made them does not alter that conclusion. Anybody can pay for silence if the person he's paying has no duty to tell the story she wants to tell. If she's free to sit on that story or tell it or sell it, paying her does not become a crime, whether you're a politician or anyone else.
All right, do you agree with that?
No.
You don't agree with it because?
Because I think the law of what the prosecution's arguing here is that it's not just a hush money payment. That could have been made back in 2016 at any time, years before. It was made 2 weeks before the election. It was done, arguably, is what the prosecution is saying, it was done with the intent to make sure it did not come out before the election, and that is considered to be election interference. That's what they're arguing. If it's done by unlawful means, right? Unlawful means, and then we're getting into the jury instructions of—
Rod?
Election interference is not a crime. He was charged with falsifying business records to cover up a legal payment. So the charge was not you interfered with the election. That was the lawyer's argument, the prosecutor's argument. But that's not a crime. So they twisted the law, which makes it legal to pay someone to sit on a story she has no duty to tell, to make it a crime, election interference, which isn't a crime. And then they used something that happened after the election to shore that up.
Well, it's in the jury instructions given to the jury about the election crime. That
Was
was
it
the
in the
predicate.
indictment?
So the indictment, no. And Believe me, there's issues with the legal case. I'm not denying that at all. I agree there are many issues with the legal case.
Well, that's
I'm
a
just
yes or
sticking
no
to-
question. Was it in the indictment?
No, it was not. It was not. And not only that, but there was a lot that wasn't in the indictment that the DA then put into a statement of facts later. But the issue and the problem with that is every defendant under the Sixth Amendment of the Constitution has the right to know the charges against them. In this case, the indictment didn't lay all of this out. In fact, no one found out about this until during the trial.
Isn't that a bit of a problem?
That is a problem.
A huge problem.
That's a very big question of whether due process was violated here.
Yeah, and that's what we're saying. If you get charged with something, you kind of ought to know what it is.
Right.
And if you go on trial for something, you ought to kind of know what you're being tried for.
That's right.
Because you kind of want to make your defense in response to what you're being tried for. And if you don't know that until during the trial,
Yes.
that's a problem.
Yeah.
There were two things going on here, in my view, with the way the prosecutor charged this case. He charged only falsifying business records, but he put out a separate document that he didn't want to charge Trump with doing, but it said he violated the federal campaign contribution laws, he violated the federal tax laws, and he committed election interference by conspiring to make this payment before the election. Well, a New York prosecutor's got no jurisdiction over federal campaign contribution law or federal tax law, and he knew better than to actually try to prove that this payment for silence was a crime. He argued it, but didn't ask the jury to find it and didn't charge for it.
He just prejudiced them
Correct.
with all of that information. And you agree he didn't have jurisdiction.
No, the way I see it is that he charged falsifying business documents, which he can do. But the problem with it is that was a misdemeanor. The statute of limitations had run, so he couldn't just stick there. So then he had to add a predicate crime to make it, in other words, a second crime to make it a felony.
Do you believe this case will be reversed?
I do, undoubtedly.
You don't think it's a close call?
I do not. Now, I don't know the New York Court of Appeals, but
That's the issue.
I wanted to share my final thought about this. This weaponization of our great institutions, the FBI, Justice Department, and individual states' similar institutions, will lead to one of two outcomes. One is more of the same from the other side, tit for tat. That may seem deserved, but it is not the right way forward for America. The other is what I call on you to demand from your politicians today, an end to this craziness in order to save the soul and sanity of our country. The Pope has actually given us the right approach in his new book when he says, we are all brothers and sisters, and there must be no resentment among us. For any war to truly end, forgiveness is necessary. That is true of any war, including our current cultural war. We need our Justice Department to return to the business of meting out justice and not running the political agendas of those currently in power, blindly seeking convictions, warranted or otherwise, and attacking political opponents. That requires a very few important things from each of you, from all of us. Finding your voice, forgiveness, and focus on the way forward. Forgive them, for they know not what they do. Forgiveness, and at the same time requiring better. We are not some banana republic, for God's sakes. What are we going to do next? Have a Putin poisoning posse and start finding political opponents foaming at the mouth at home, not so mysteriously dying in their lazy boy recliners? We're better than that. We must be better than that. I don't like what I see happening in our country. This kind of thing is exactly why I launched Merit Street Media and wrote, We've Got Issues. I don't like seeing the weaponization of our justice system, agencies, and powerful government actions that frankly just make my skin crawl for all of us and for my grandchildren. And let's be honest, this is so not just about Trump. If you let your hatred for Donald Trump compromise your ability to find true north on your moral compass, shame on you. If you let your disgust for Biden make you blind to the inevitable consequences of pursuing revenge, then God help the children who will inherit the dystopian nightmare we create. We need leaders who will pledge to end this vicious cycle right now and return us to that safe place where our institutions are no longer bastardized and weaponized, but rather simply serve their intended purpose. We have serious problems to solve, and it will take serious people to solve them. Men and women who we hold accountable for doing that which they were selected or hired to do. They need to know we are watching, and their positions are privileges, not legacies. They work for us until they don't. I'm not into politics. I claim no expertise, nor do I seek any. I don't advocate voting for one candidate over another. I stay in my lane addressing human behavior collectively, culturally, and am focused on how we can have maximum control in our lives and turn this ship of state called America in the right direction and get her back on track so we can be proud. That's my mission, and this is a call to action to save our collective soul and sanity. This is also a call to redemption, healing, and forgiveness that leads to peace among us all, which is the most important gift we can share in our dangerous world.